Hello, and welcome to our town hall focused on planning for spring 2021 here at Johns Hopkins University. I'm Lainey Rutko, a professor in the Bloomberg School of Public Health and senior advisor to Johns Hopkins President Ron Daniels. I serve as one of the team members leading our 2021 planning efforts, and I want to begin with a special welcome to all of the families who are joining us. We are so pleased to offer this session as part of our virtual family weekend. I'll be the moderator this evening, and I'm joined by three of my university colleagues who lead our 2021 planning work. Today, I'm here with Stephen Ganji, Executive Vice Provost for Academic Affairs and a professor in the Bloomberg School of Public Health, John Links, Vice Provost and Chief Risk and Compliance Officer for the university, and also a professor in the Bloomberg School of Public Health, and Alana Shanahan, Vice Provost for Student Affairs. We have the following goals for this town hall. First, to provide insight into the process by which Johns Hopkins University has been making decisions around the virtual versus in-person versus hybrid experience. Second, to provide an understanding of the current COVID-19 conditions in Baltimore, how these might compare to national and international conditions, and how this affects Johns Hopkins decision-making. And finally, to answer questions from parents and families about the spring planning process. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Stephen Ganji, who will speak about academic planning.
Thanks, Lainey, and let me thank all of you for participating in today's town hall. As a parent of a recent Johns Hopkins undergraduate student and another student who attends college overseas, I certainly understand the concerns and apprehension and desire for certainty in these uncertain times. As Lainey indicated, we've started our spring planning in earnest, and our overall planning approach is similar to how we planned for fall, using a variety of contingencies depending on what the public health situation will present us with. As you all know, university leadership decided, based on the trends in the public health situation this summer, both here in Baltimore and in the locales where our students reside, it would be better to remain in what we call our phase one operational posture, which is limited to essential low density activities. Many things have really gone well in this fall in terms of our planning that we did over the course of the summer. We have been doing surveys of our students, early surveys, and we are really encouraged to see that they're able to, for the most part, to participate in classes, achieve their learning objectives, and increasingly finding ways to connect with faculty. But we also know our students are anxious to get on campus, and our surveys of students have portrayed that loudly and clearly. They miss the association with other students, and they miss the full experience of being a Johns Hopkins student. As such, we're looking at the public health situation to see what we can do for spring. As always, health and safety come first. And we are continuing to monitor the trajectory of the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly as we enter the winter months and concomitant influenza season. The data here in Baltimore, in Maryland, has been positive. Over the course of several months, we've seen declines followed by some rises. But with the shift of who is infected to a more younger population, the rises that we did see did not translate into an enormous burden on our healthcare system, and has since that rise actually come down to a lower level. And we follow detailed data on our participants, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the work that we're doing, as well as the data that we have, or the plans that we have in place. And of course, we're following the national situation carefully, and even the international situation, knowing and learning from all the manifestations of COVID. We're also looking very carefully at our peers to see what worked and what hasn't. And I think it's fair to say that we've certainly seen a number of trends of important aspects that are associated with prevention, right? Prevention is essential, and I'm pleased that we have many things in place in terms of our planning for on-campus activities that we were even planning for at the beginning of the fall. And it's also important to recognize that we don't expect zero cases. Some campuses have been, at a low level, and we've seen examples of campuses where there have been very, very high levels. And I think one of the key considerations has been partly the prevention of anyone getting infected, but it's also the response, right? Ensuring that if there are COVID cases on campus in the community, that the university is able to respond appropriately. And that has definitely influenced how we are planning for spring. And we'll certainly talk about some of those aspects in a little bit. In terms of academic planning, we are working hand in hand with faculty, departments, dean's offices on identifying the academic priorities for spring. We are clearly wanting to lead with academics and are trying to optimize all of our plan so that we'll be able to offer as much of a fulsome set of activities as possible. That activity is ongoing right now. We don't have all of the answers. We're still working closely. Part of our goal in this town hall is to tell you where we are a bit in that process, as well as through your questions, able to get perhaps some of the questions answered, but also to identify areas that are of concern to you. So even if we don't have answers, your questions in themselves are really helpful. And so, I think that, as you hear our other aspects of planning, just please recognize, Johns Hopkins is a big place, and we are doing our best to integrate all of these activities together. We would not offer academic opportunities unless we feel we're appropriately ready from the student affairs and residential side for undergraduates, as well as prepared from the operational and health and safety side for all of the things that we need to have in place. And again, we'll talk a little bit more detail about some of those things through this town hall. So let me turn things, Lainey, back to you.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm now going to turn to John Links, who will speak about operational planning.
Good evening. So as Stephen alluded to, we have a multi-phase approach to all of our planning of phases 0, 1, 2, and 3, which represent increasing on-campus density. We're currently in phase 1, which is a low density operating posture. And movement to the next phase involves a comprehensive vetting process driven by data, not surprisingly, and in consultation with our health advisory group. What we're doing now is to plan and act as though we'll be in phase 2, a medium density operating posture for the spring semester, recognizing, of course, that things could change at the last minute if public health conditions worsen. A significant part of trying to ensure that we can, in fact, move to phase 2 for the spring semester is a focus on public health control measures to minimize transmission of COVID on campus. And you've heard us, I'm sure, talk before about the 4 pillars of control measures: masking, distancing, hygiene, and room ventilation. And we put a lot of effort into those 4 pillars of control, and will continue to put a lot of effort into those 4. But in addition, we've added a significant focus on testing. And when we speak about testing, there are 3 basic uses: medical management, epidemiologic surveillance, and mass testing. And we're doing all 3 right now. So everyone who has symptoms is getting tested by us and then medically managed. Their close contacts identified and notified and also medically managed. We have an ongoing surveillance study of several hundred undergrads, grad students, staff, and faculty to understand the prevalence of COVID on and around campus. And those several hundred folk are also tested twice weekly. And in addition, we're testing all residential students twice weekly for mass testing. That third use, mass testing, we are intensively planning right now to greatly expand that use for the spring, to greatly expand mass testing, and to consider for whom it would be mandatory versus voluntary. But no matter what, we think that mass testing becomes a 5th pillar of public health control measures for the spring. Lainey?
Thanks, John. And now I'd like to turn to Alana, who will speak about student life planning.
Great, thanks, Lainey. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being with us. We know this is probably a challenging time, but I'm hopeful you enjoy some of our family weekend programming. So I want to take a couple of minutes and just talk about some pieces I'm sure you're curious about. And let's probably start with one of the most important, which is how we think about housing this spring, particularly for our 1st and 2nd year students who traditionally live in on-campus housing. We've thought a lot about the size of the community that we can bring back this spring. And obviously, the public health conditions will dictate quite a bit of that. But my goal is to ensure that if we are in a position to bring X number of students back to campus, that I can accommodate those students who desire to be with us. So one of the things that your student will see potentially as early as Sunday night is a survey that we'll send to all undergraduates, asking them to basically share with us that if we are open in the spring for on-campus experiences, what would they intend to do? Assuming we're in phase 2, which again, the details of what phases are on our website, and John spoke to that. But what would they intend to do? Many of your students are living at home. Do they think that they will continue to live at home even if we had some in-person offerings? Would they like to come to campus? Would they like to secure their own housing in the Charles Village area? Would they like to live in on-campus residences in one of our dorms? So this is really important information for us to be able to plan appropriately, regardless of sort of what position we take as far as who we can accommodate. Our team knowing what you're interested in doing is really important for us to be able to build out the capacity to accommodate your desires, again, assuming the public health conditions allow it. So I ask for the students that are on this town hall, as well as their families, I really encourage you to speak with your students about this survey, ask them to really be thoughtful about filling it out and give us their best sense of what their intentions would be this spring. Again, it's just going to help us ensure that we can acquire as much housing as we need to accommodate that interest, and ideally acquire housing that's meaningful to your student, ideally within walking distance of the campus. So that would be the first piece that I really want to stress. It's the most important piece that's likely coming up in this next week to a week and a half. So ask your students to keep their eye out for that survey. The next piece is just, the support of your students, both now and as we move into the spring. I want to draw your attention to an organization on campus called Student Outreach and Support. And this is a group of professionals that can really help your student navigate any challenge they're facing that sort of crosses boundaries. It may have a bit of an academic bent, but it may also have a mental health concern. It may include contemplation of a leave of absence. This is a team of professionals that can help your student navigate any challenges that maybe don't fit squarely in one bucket. So easy for your student to get in touch with this team. You can just Google JHU Student Outreach and Support, and that office will pop up. You can make an appointment online. You can schedule with a counselor. There's all different ways by which students can connect to this office virtually. So if you feel as though your students may be in a place where they have questions that cross quite a few spaces and they need somebody to help triage, it's a great place to focus some outreach and for your student to be in touch. Another thing I wanted to touch on is just as we think about spring and as we think about the academic experience, our goal is to provide students great flexibility and great optionality. So we don't want students to feel like, even if we are in person and welcome everybody back, that they need to be here. Our goal is to allow them to advance their academic progress and their academic standing, whether they choose to be on campus or choose to continue their academic experience virtually. So I wanted to make sure that as students and families are thinking about spring now, they were quite clear on the fact that we intend to uphold that goal of, again, allowing students to be able to advance their academic progress, again, whether they're here or whether they're choosing the remote option. Two other pieces that I just want to mention quickly before I send it back to Lainey. Again, financial aid, please, any families that continue to have challenges around financing and education, whether it's right now or whether it comes spring, please be in touch with our financial aid office. You do not have to wait until the one time of year that you submit financial aid paperwork to do this process. Anytime family circumstances change significantly, you should be in touch with the financial aid office. So I just, again, wanted to remind you that door is open. And also just wanted to also remind you that for your students, if you're seeing your students and they seem to be sort of kind of struggling in that mental health space, don't be afraid to encourage your students, or even for you to peek at a resource that we provide online, and it's wellness.jhu.edu. And it really provides for our students a myriad of well-being and wellness information and programming that I think is just wonderful in this time of a little bit of anxiety, obviously, with so much up in the air and so much change. But please don't hesitate to encourage your students to take advantage of that resource. It's got wonderful information around telemedicine and a bunch of wonderful sort of mental health apps that students can really use and engage no matter where they are. So with that, Lainey, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Alana. And before we move into our Q&A, I wanted to just mention the consultative process that we use as part of our planning. And you've heard about a few of these different groups from Stephen, John, and Alana, but to quickly pull it all together, first and foremost, health and safety of our community will always be our priority. And that means that we continue to be guided by our medical and our public health experts. We've assembled multiple COVID-19 specific groups, and they routinely provide advice and consultation and feedback to university leadership. And these groups include a health advisory group, which is composed of leading members of our faculty in public health and medicine, a student advisory committee, which includes representatives that span the full student body from freshmen through doctoral students, and also a university pandemic academic advisory committee, which includes faculty representatives from the university's different schools. And with that, I'm going to switch over to focus on Q&A. And I want to encourage anyone who's watching, please submit questions. We're here to answer them this evening. Okay, John, first question is for you, and it concerns testing. When you talk about testing, what do you mean exactly? Is it nose, cheek, and what is the turnaround time that you're thinking of?
Great question. So testing is actually a very complicated and if you follow the media, confused topic. So there's really two different things to think about here. The first is, where does the sample come from? And originally, all diagnostic samples were from a nasopharyngeal swab. That's the one where the Q-tip goes way, way, way up into the nose. We call it the tickle the brain swab. More recently, there are two other sites in the nose that don't require the swab to go as far up: a mid-turbinate swab and an anterior nares swab. And then in addition, some are using scraping the inside of the cheek. That's called a buccal swab. And then, of course, there's saliva. Right now at Hopkins, all diagnostic tests for medical management use the nasopharyngeal or NP swab as administered by a healthcare professional. But our surveillance study and our mass testing of residential students is a mid-turbinate swab. It's still in the nose, but it's self-collected by the person being tested under our observation. So it's not a Q-tip as far up, and it's readily collected by the person themselves. Having said that, we're keenly interested in saliva as an alternative and are talking with the leading groups around the country who are using saliva. On the assay side, you've heard about nucleic acid testing, you've heard about antigen testing, and you've heard about antibody testing. All of the testing we're doing is nucleic acid right now, but we're following the other forms of what you can test for in the sample as well. So we're keeping an open mind about the approach to sample collection and the approach to the assay of the virus in the sample.
Thanks, John. Stephen, this question is for you. Can you speak to how, if and how we've looked at other peer universities for how they've brought students back to campus as an example of what we might do?
Sure. Very important set of natural experiments going on across the US. I think that one of the key clear messages is preparation, and preparation along the pillars that John Links talked about before. So ensuring first that there are policies in place to, I should say, even setting up the environment, de-densifying as much as possible, ensuring that buildings are set up with appropriate ventilation, and our health and safety staff have been through all of our buildings to make sure that they are meeting the standards or exceeding the standards for ventilation. Ensuring that if facilities are set up, they're set up with appropriate guidance that minimizes the opportunity for transmission if someone is positive. So we just released today our latest revised guidelines for instructional return. It includes our health and safety guidelines and expectations for how classrooms should be set up to ensure that there's proper distance when people are there. It's important to, all the good schools have policies about the kind of approaches that John mentioned, ensuring that people are using masks, that there's proper distancing, and other hygiene on campus. Putting all of that, as almost a given, we, forget that 9 months ago, this was not part of our normal life, right? But we've all integrated these issues and accepted, for the most part, the adaptation of these measures. What are the key things that are specific for the successful universities? And as I alluded to at the beginning of this session, I think the idea of truly responding when positive cases occur, ensuring that there is a way to identify those students as rapidly as possible, and that's where increased testing comes into play to help us do that. Of course, symptomatic testing is always going to be an option, but we want to identify people as early as possible. That's where we're improving our asymptomatic testing. And then to ensure that students who may be positive have some place to go, that they're able to quarantine if they're suspected of being positive, as well as isolate if they are positive. So all of those measures we are building out, or have built out in our preparations. I think that, again, you look at the successful schools, they've integrated these strategies at a larger scale. Some of them have had the advantage of being in settings that are not larger urban areas. Ithaca, New York, for example, is an order of magnitude smaller than urban Baltimore. Yet, we have seen peers in more densified areas implement these strategies successfully. So we're in constant contact with the leadership of these schools, learning from them and modifying our own approaches for our preparation.
Thanks, Stephen. Alana, can you speak to spring sports and the current thinking, please?
Sure. So appreciate that sports and spring sports specifically obviously take a lot of coordination at the institutional level, but then a lot of coordination at the conference level. So I would say at this point, our athletic directors across the conference, as well as presidents across the conference, are discussing our opportunities around athletics. I would say the presidents even as often as monthly, and the athletic directors likely more often than that. So you could imagine there are a range of scenarios as far as how we may be able to move fall sports forward into the spring and winter sports into the spring. So there's quite a bit on the table. And I would just share that as those plans again develop, we'll be in touch. But I would say so much right now as we're talking just about obviously Hopkins generally and our ability to reopen in the spring. So much is dictated by what each campus feels comfortable in moving forward. And then what we feel we can do as a collective, because it could be a situation where we actually have just a percentage of our conference providing competitive opportunities, and potentially a percentage that's just providing practice opportunities, and honestly, everything in between. So I think my goal at this point is just to hopefully give you all confidence that these conversations are happening really at all levels, all the way up and through university presidents.
Thanks, Alana. Another question for you. What is the university doing to help combat social isolation for all students, but especially for first-year students?
Yeah, so this is, this one is challenging. We've made significant investments, I would say across the board, but particularly as we think about our first-year students. Unfortunately, first-year students have really gotten a raw deal. They had a really challenging end of their high school career and a really challenging start to their collegiate careers. So we have an orientation program that's traditionally 6 days in length. And this year, we extended that to basically 6 months. So I'm hopeful at this point, if you're a parent of a first year, you've heard that first year talk about the first year mentor experience. And not only are they paired with a first year mentor that's in essence meant to be their guide as they transition to college, but they also have a first year mentor group where they're actually getting to know on a more personal level other first year students within their kind of group. And that's obviously meant to foster some social bonds, as well as provide connectivity not only to one another, but to campus resources. In some respects, even connectivity to faculty. So the first year mentor program is a significant piece of how we're trying to help first year students build out of that isolation. We also have, and again, many of you will know this, a myriad of just clubs and programming. And we have over 400, and just because we've moved to a virtual environment doesn't mean that activity has stopped. In many respects, that activity has blossomed. In some ways, our students are connecting more. They don't have to walk, 4 blocks to get to their student organization meeting. They can just connect virtually. And we're seeing whether it's participation in student government or participation in some other student organization. In many respects, we're seeing heightened participation. We have a student involvement fair annually where students can see and touch and feel, in some respects, the leadership of all 400 of our clubs. We had a 52% increase in participation in that involvement fair. And I honestly believe part of that is this virtual environment and the ease of which you can actually interact with people in some respects, maybe in a less threatening way. You don't actually have to approach somebody and feel you need to engage in conversation, but you can gather information maybe in a way that feels a bit more comfortable. So again, whether it's programming that's specific to first years, whether it's the constant reinforcement of the number of organizations they can join, or whether it's just ability for first years to kind of drop in and connect with our staff. I appreciate this is not necessarily connections to one another, but almost all of our units across student affairs at this point are having some semblance of open hours, drop-in hours, really encouraging our students to connect when they need help or when they don't need help. Our LGBTQ Center, for example, our Multicultural Affairs Office, all of these offices are really running kind of open hours for students to kind of drop in and express any concern or idea that they may have. So we're trying to bang at this on multiple fronts. I think what you might imagine is that, our students are, whether they're first years or upperclassmen, they're also feeling a bit of Zoom fatigue. So the challenge is we have so much programming. They're obviously doing their coursework online. So we're a little concerned about, geez, do we just keep building out more programming on Zoom? And are we sadly adding to the challenge of just the Zoom fatigue and everything that's happening in this environment? So we're trying to manage that balance. We're also actually, as part of the survey that I mentioned earlier, that really is focused on sort of your housing intentions for the spring, we're also asking a question: what do students really need from an engagement perspective? We understand that the peer-to-peer connectivity is likely the hardest thing to do in this environment, but where might we be missing the boat as far as fostering that connectivity? How can we be helpful as student orgs navigate the challenge of trying to connect their membership? So we're looking for the creative ideas of your children to help us sort of bolster what they feel might be missing. It won't be perfect because we won't, obviously at this point in time, have the chance to be together, but we are, in addition to evaluating our programming, consistently running programming, trying to find new and novel ways to connect students to one another as well as to us as professionals. We really do want their feedback, and we want to be cognizant of not sort of over programming via Zoom, given everything that's already out there. So I would also encourage, for those parents that feel their student isn't connected, again, spending some time on the kind of student affairs website. We have a virtual programming calendar on our website. And when you look at the number of activities that are taking place just in the course of 1 week, I dare to say there are hundreds. So if you're the parent of a first year student who's really struggling to find their place, don't hesitate to spend some time on that website and see where you might think your child might be able to plug in. I trust me, you will find a plentiful list of opportunities that hopefully would pique their interest.
Thanks, Alana. Stephen, can you speak to the timeline or timing for decision-making relative to spring 2021, please?
Sure. So there's two parts to this. One is just a recognition that in all of our planning, that because we are monitoring the public health situation, we have to leave optionality open. If things, even in early part of January, look very different than they look right now, with increases in COVID and burdens on the healthcare system, that we and our consulted bodies, the Health Advisory Group and others, feel is inappropriate for bringing back students. We will have to make some tough later decisions in the same way that we made decisions for fall. I think that barring that, assuming that things more or less are similar to the situation right now, we recognize that there is a tension between wanting to know as soon as possible, as well as the time we need and our faculty need for planning things in a fulsome manner. So what we have put forward as a initial plan is to try to get decisions made clearly as soon as possible, and communicated out in a way that would allow for students to register for their classes before Thanksgiving break. Now, you might, many of you may say, well, that seems very, very late. Registering by Thanksgiving break actually has, several weeks prior to that of needs, academic needs. Our academic advisors, work very closely with the undergraduates for helping them understand and put their schedules together. So in order to have enough time for that work to go forward, we would, clearly have to make at least an initial plan available several weeks before that. So I would not anticipate, we are trying to bring, broad aspects of our decision making forward as soon as they're made. We don't have any unique announcements on this town hall to make. I would envision over the next several weeks, we will have additional town halls. We will continue to share if particular decisions and operational plans come into place. But my anticipation is the broad plan that would help you and your family make decisions would likely be made, not before probably the 1st of November, so that we could, again, meet our schedule for getting things in place so that registration could take place before Thanksgiving. I will also just address a part of the question, since I saw the question, about whether the format that will come back in. I think it's unlikely, highly unlikely, that we would be entirely in person and not have remote and virtual offerings. And in fact, in our initial fall planning, we had made a commitment to maintain optionality, both for faculty and students. And I'm fairly certain that it's safe to say that we will continue with that kind of optionality that would allow for students who, for whatever reason, they're not comfortable or they can't come back to campus, that they would still be able to maintain academic progress on a remote basis. So that's our working assumption. It was the working assumption over the summer as we were planning for fall, and I think is a fair assumption for spring as well.
Thanks, Stephen. John, question for you. Will the university mandate flu and/or COVID-19 vaccine, should that be available, for students who live on campus and off campus?
So we have already mandated the seasonal flu vaccine for anyone who's going to be on campus this fall, and that, of course, will extend to the winter and spring as well. By November 20th, you must have received a flu vaccination or an exception due to religious or medical reasons through a formal process in order to come onto campus. And for everyone else, we are strongly encouraging getting a flu shot this year, even if folks normally don't. And to that end, we have a very expanded free flu vaccine program in collaboration with Walgreens, where you can walk into any Walgreens and get the shot for free. You download a voucher from our website, and any Walgreens in the country is prepared to accept that voucher. So we are heavily promoting flu vaccination this year and mandating it for anyone on campus. In that regard, since we're talking about bringing students back in the spring who are not on campus now, please have your students get a flu shot now so that they don't find themselves at the end of January hunting for a flu shot in a season where a lot more people than usual may try to get a flu shot. With respect to a COVID vaccine, we have a task force between the university and the health system that's looking at the development and rollout of a vaccine. It is highly unlikely that we would, at this point, mandate a first vaccine when it becomes available without knowing any of the particulars of that vaccine in terms of availability, the prioritization scheme in terms of who can even get it, and its characteristics and target populations. So the flu shot, we've already mandated. The COVID vaccine is much more of a monitoring the situation.
Thanks, John. Another question for you. Are we thinking about doing wastewater testing and then subsequently quarantining a dorm should samples come back positive?
So the short answer is no, we're not considering doing that. And the reason is wastewater sampling is a very efficient process, but it's not a very sensitive process. So the virus is shed in feces, and you collect and test wastewater from a dorm. But if you think about it, that wastewater is pretty diluted. And so you'd need a lot of students in the dorm shedding virus through feces to get a signal. If we were not already testing every single residential student because we couldn't, maybe we'd think about it, but we are testing every single residential student twice a week. And I said earlier, we're still thinking through who would be mandatory and who would be voluntary in the spring for a mass testing program, but it's an absolute certainty that residential students will be required to be tested at least twice a week. And we will very likely follow the approach of one of our peers who we admire their testing program of increasing the testing in locales where we see particular hotspots or outbreaks. So if with the twice a week testing in the dorms, we see an increase or flare up, we would very likely increase the testing even further. And therefore there's no need for wastewater testing.
Thanks, John. Stephen, question for you. Are students currently being surveyed to get input about what they see as their top concerns relative to the current virtual model, any issues with classes or academic support?
Yep. So back when we initially pivoted in the spring, shortly after we came back and initiated classes, we initiated quickly a university-wide survey of all of our students. That was a useful survey. It was not administered for a long period of time, but allowed us to get a calibration and help identify where there were concerns and where some quick investments may need to be made. So we have done that as well. Our survey, in addition to school-based surveys or even department-based surveys that are being done by the academic units, we have administered a university-wide survey that just closed at the beginning of this week. So it only ran last week, which is a very early time, clearly, in the academic term, but we wanted to get at exactly the point, Lainey, that you raised. What are the early concerns expressed by students, and that would give us an opportunity to feed that back to the dean's offices and to the instructors to make sure that we are meeting the needs of our students. I'm really glad that we had an almost 50% response rate across our undergraduate students, which for a university survey was, we felt, a tremendous response. For the most part, I would say, as I indicated briefly before, students indicated even better than in the spring that they are able to participate with the remote instruction activities that we've put into place. We have, in the course of the survey, opened text fields for us students to respond with their concerns. We have already started to, over the course of the last several days, not only mine and aggregate those concerns, but also ensure that they're getting passed back to the schools. it is a combination of a wide spectrum of things, ranging from technical issues through, students who have used this as an opportunity to express, difficulty with their situation, such as international students who are struggling sometimes with time zone differences between the time a course is offered synchronously and where they may be. As well as other aspects that we have truly tried to follow up on and will continue to follow up on.
Thanks, Stephen. And a quick follow-up to that. Can you please speak to what's being done now to ensure the quality of instruction?
So again, in my mind, there's kind of two parts to that. One of them has to do with just how we prepared, right? The investments that we made over the course of the summer, recognizing that we were, regardless of of our operational position, going to be doing more online teaching. And so made significant investments across the institution to upgrade our facilities for delivering instruction. So preparation has been a big part of that. Ensuring the faculty are trained, ensuring that these new studios and other equipment are widely available, and the different schools have undertaken different ways for using that capability. In addition, the primary responsibility for quality of instruction certainly rests with the schools and their academic leadership. And they are in constant contact with their own instructors and working through plans in a way that is, sharing the best practices of how to best teach in this environment. So, there's certainly have been a lot of preparations, but also a lot of, continued learning, particularly from those instructors who may not have done this kind of instruction previously or in the spring. So, groups getting together to share their best, experience and work with departments to make sure that that together they feel that they're delivering a high quality experience. And I would say, one of the comments of students is, like many of us in the Zoom and COVID era, they feel that their workload is actually higher than what they would have anticipated. And I think that that has both pluses and minuses to it. It's I think indicative that our faculty have continued to offer a high quality, challenging program. And despite our limitations for getting together, have not diminished the quality of the education. So I think that's important. On the flip side, you can say, well, we certainly don't want to be, we want to pay attention to students' mental health. We want to be sure that, all of the academic offerings are not overwhelming them. And so, we're also evaluating burden and ensuring that all of our instructors are aware of these students' comments.
Thanks very much, Stephen.
Mm-hmm.
Alana, question for you. If we are in person in the spring, will we have an orientation for new students?
Absolutely. So as you might imagine, the orientation will look a bit different, and will heavily focus again on those peer-to-peer social connections to our campus, and connections to the city of Baltimore, which is so much the part of the experience we want our students to have. So maybe a modest pivot, but still absolutely we'll have an in-person orientation. We'll also have programming that really is best done in person, that we really struggled to think there was a high value in a virtual format. And when you think about those trainings, bystander intervention training, alcohol and other drug training, and a lot of training in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, we find those trainings really, when they're delivered virtually, don't have the same meaning and impact. So those would be trainings. Some we would do immediately upon arrival, and some would definitely be positioned throughout the course of the semester, because again, pulling all these groups together for these trainings, we also have to do in a physically distanced way over time. But absolutely, we would look forward to our orientation come spring. And again, really our opportunity to foster those peer-to-peer connections and our students' connections to Baltimore.
Thanks very much, Alana. And given that we're closing in on 7 p.m., I'm going to wrap up. And I want to close this town hall with a really important acknowledgement. As professors and student affairs professionals, we all thoroughly enjoy working with students, and we were bitterly disappointed that we couldn't bring them back this fall. And we keep that sentiment top of mind as we engage in the planning process for spring 2021. So thank you all for joining us this evening. And while I know we weren't able to answer every question, I do hope that this session has provided additional clarity about our planning for the spring. Stay safe, and I very much hope that you enjoy the rest of Family Weekend. Thank you.